Welcome to the Officio Spotlight on Procurement podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for listening. Today, I'm very privileged to be joined on the podcast by Courtney Blake. Courtney was, until very recently, and for reasons I'm sure most people have read about on the news, a senior humanitarian advisor and team leader at USAID. And she's held numerous other roles within that organisation previously. Prior to that, she was the Child Protection Strategic Planning Consultant at Save the Children, and has also held roles at the United Nations Population Fund and the International Rescue Committee. So Courtney, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Your background and experience is clearly fascinating, and I have the privilege of having had a prep call to understand a bit more about that, and it will come out in the conversation. But I guess for our astute listeners, it's not a career that's obviously in our profession of procurement and supply chain, which are typically the guests that we're lucky enough to talk to on the podcast. However, in previous episodes, we talked about things like supply chain risk or geopolitical instability, managing challenging stakeholders, decision-making and complexity. And it's really clear talking to you that these are all topics that you've dealt with on a day-to-day basis in incredibly complicated and difficult scenarios. So I wondered perhaps if we could start there really, and perhaps if we could maybe that idea about kind of decision-making and complexity, and if you could kind of bring to life a little bit of your experience for our listeners, that would, I think, be absolutely fascinating.
Thanks. And it's really a pleasure to join you guys today. Yeah. So, I think that my career arc has been, I think, a little bit unusual. I started off with USAID around 13 years ago as a, bright-eyed and eager child protection and emergencies advisor. But for various, events, foreign and domestic, it really evolved in ways that I never really would have imagined.
Right.
I think one of the main things that came along quite early was the West Africa Ebola response. I mean, truly, truly unprecedented situation, even though small Ebola outbreaks are quite typical. What we saw raging across West Africa and the global impacts in 2014 were truly unprecedented. By the time I got out to Liberia, where I played a key role in leading the response, we had something like nearly 10,000 cases, nearly 5,000 deaths across multiple countries. But with trade routes, flights, all of those sort of related things, we saw at a much larger scale in the pandemic really rearing their heads. And that was very much we're going to throw everything we have at this. We know a lot about how to do basic Ebola response management, but what it looks like when it's multiple countries and at a scale spreading it the way that it was something that was truly unprecedented. And there was a bit of a push to really just throw as much resources and capacity, but also people that had demonstrated the ability to just think things through, take on the unknown and work out the best, whatever that means in that context, way forward. And from there, it's been quite similar. I've had the opportunity to staff colleagues that are covering major Security Council negotiations and help them work out what would the humanitarian impact of the things that are in front of them be. What are ways they could proactively utilize their perch to strengthen a humanitarian response, whether we're talking about Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, DRC, Central African Republic. Sorry, we speak quite a lot in acronyms, which I'll try and avoid not to do. But then on more recently to things like helping us after the fall of the Republic in Afghanistan, reshape the kinds of conversations we were having with the Taliban so that, the humanitarian needs there in 2021 that were deteriorating significantly could sit at the forefront and be properly situated within the context of much larger and very difficult discussions, on through to the role that I played last year, serving for the government out in Jerusalem as the advisor to our special envoy on Gaza. And it's, kind of across that spectrum, the things that make crises difficult to navigate is that the risks are really high. There are very few good or right answers. And it really just takes very different kinds of approach to managing risks, to working internally and externally with stakeholders and partners to work out what right looks like and the best course of action to get there.
You started with that example of Ebola. So you kind of got a massively complicated situation that I guess you get kind of to some extent parachuted into, or you and your colleagues. How do you even start to understand? Because there must be a myriad of decisions that need to be made constantly and all the time. Like how do you prioritize? How on earth do you manage through that decision-making complexity to to maybe not make the right decision, but at least the best decision, right?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, I think one of the main things, whether it was in Ebola or in a similar kind of crisis, is really just being clear on what your purpose and your values are. Those are going to get tested and stretched. But if you're not clear on what that overarching objective is, what you are there to do, and the basis on which you're going to take decisions, you're really going to struggle. That applied across the Ebola response. It's the same thing with Afghanistan, my experience on Gaza, but many, many other crises. It's very hard to know which way is up, especially when there's just going to be so much information, so many people coming at you. I mean, in that way, different stakeholders in the government, external partners, the press, the
Yeah.
American public, and things like this. But I think, another part of that too is you really need decision-making structures that allow for different kinds of voices and perspectives at the table. You need to be able to discern what is an essential variable versus something to consider, but it doesn't need to kind of clog up your decision making.
Right.
And in the government, it's often not easy, but I think that's likely true, in a lot of different kinds of organizations. They tend to be big, and the higher up you go towards that decision making apex, it's hierarchical. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the information as it's going up is going to be the right information.
Yeah.
And so in emergency contexts, typically what we do is we really have, quite blended skills that are embedded in the team. A lot of those people are given avenues to speak and brief senior leadership so that those data points are front and center in their minds. And we're able to get to the right outcomes. But it's also, I think a function of really leveraging expertise and being clear on when you can take a good enough decision,
Yeah.
and when it really needs to be like exacting.
Yeah.
Those are conversations you should have in advance, some sort of basis on which to work through that. But there's part of the Ebola science that had to be ironclad, protecting medical workers, reducing person-to-person transmission.
Yeah.
But there were other parts of it where, generally speaking, a broader blanket approach that did a reasonably good job, really was sufficient to meeting the purpose and utilizing the, experts at Centers for Disease Control, utilizing the global health experts we had in-house, working closely with our Liberian counterparts who really knew the context. You're able to really patch that together.
Courtney, we mentioned at the start, so we're procurement and supply chain podcast, and typically, so we spend a lot of time talking to senior kind of procurement supply chain people in the private sector and at the moment we talk a lot about geopolitical risk, right? Because people are trying to understand how to operate businesses in complicated global scenarios. Again, for you, that scenario must be, like you mentioned, Yemen. I mean, how on earth you go about looking at managing a supply chain for the things that you would have needed in your work in Yemen must be unbearably complicated, right?
Yeah. Now it's also where, utilizing your experts is really significant. Internally, we've typically at USAID leaned on people who have solely run logistics for the US government for a long time, but really close partnerships with organizations like the World Food Program that, in addition to their more substantive role dealing with food security and food needs, are really global, shall we say, sovereign capacity for the world's most vulnerable in terms of the ability to get people where they're most needed, when they're most needed. And so if you're, say, 2015, when the conflict in Yemen first erupted, that's a country that was 80 to 90% reliant on commercial exports. The impacts of the disruption on the conflict, when you had things like the Houthis taking control of Hodeidah Port or Sana'a Airport, were instantaneous and significant. 6 million people at near famine-like conditions almost straight away, because the fuel, because the wheat and everything else was unable to get in, or unable to get in predictably or at the right time. And so using the capabilities of a partner like WFP, who has the ability
Courtney,
to
sorry,
pivot.
can
Yeah, sorry.
WFP, just for
World
people
Food
that...
Program.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
nope, my mistake. Utilizing the capabilities of the World Food Program, their knowledge of the port their knowledge of the pipelines
Yeah.
to be able to do some of that initial triaging, of the flows, but then also to support us in the medium to long term scenario development, but also from those discussions, getting instructions for our political counterparts on what are the asks that we need to be making diplomatically of parties to the conflict in order to be able to alleviate those kinds of needs. But it's quite a lot of problem solving and
Yeah.
adaptability. And ideally your last line of defense rather than, your strategy from the onset.
And one of the other things we talk a lot about on this call, and I don't mean this to sound diminishing, it might do, but like the idea of dealing with difficult stakeholders and difficult individuals, talked about dealing with the Taliban. Again, how do you go about approaching having conversations in that context?
I think in that, it's a great example, that particular one. I think success there, or the approach there is a lot of listening. It's hearing them out, understanding, how they think, what's on their mind, what are their priorities, and how does that mesh up with, where you are and what you're trying to do. What was interesting in that particular situation was that the issue sets that the team I was a part of back at USAID, even though I was embedded with our embassy in exile, shall we say, in Doha, was that there was quite a lot of overlap. It was important to them in whatever way that people get fed, that healthcare continued to run, that schools continued to run, but we weren't necessarily working with the same basis of what that should look like, what's their role in it, so on and so forth. So first learning what are the priorities, how do they think, and then where are those sticking points, establishing and demonstrating back to them that we shared a lot of those same goals. And then allowing yourself to be able to have some of the harder conversations around those areas, of friction.
I think what you and your colleagues do is phenomenal, right? And it's such important work. But I've had the privilege of talking to various people over the years, and it must be so hard because the situation is so complex. Presumably, you can never get everything right, and to some extent, I get by definition you can't resolve the problems. Like just at a personal level, that must be quite challenging, right? I mean, in terms of the stress it puts on you as an individual. How do you approach that?
That's definitely a challenge. I think, especially as I say, I'm looking back to looking perhaps to do something more in the private sector, next, and pivoting my CV from a more, do-gooder aid worker orientation to something that resonates more. But everything is quantifiable and metrics and numbers. And when the problems are so big, it is really hard to see your impact. But I think that most of us cope, with it by just having a sense of what our moral compass is, standing behind that, and really trying to keep focused on what you can control and what you can't control, and bringing, like the full weight of your commitment, but also your expertise, and your networks to bear around the problem set, and, calling it a day, regardless of how it lands. But it's definitely not always easy. You see and hear and witness, quite a lot of things, a lot of really hard stuff on the ground.
Yeah.
You see when how decisions get made and where they fall short of what you might have hoped them to be and the consequences of that. So breaks and mental health are a pretty key part of it as well.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's silly for me not to ask you the question in terms of you mentioned you're looking at next steps now, and I guess to some extent that's not a scenario that that was created for you with the
Yeah.
decision about USAID. I just wondered if you had any, politics aside, any kind of personal reflections on that and the impact of aid globally now, right? It seems like a challenging time.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean, it's hugely disappointing, immensely proud of what USAID has, achieved.
Yeah.
The final day, July 1st, when it was officially the official closure of the agency, you had, you know, announcements from the administration about the new way forward, sidelining in ways I think that don't quite stand up to facts, the legacy of our work. At the same time, publications like The Lancet coming out and showing the remarkable legacy in terms of tens of millions of lives saved
Yeah.
and what's online. I do think the facts stand for itself in terms of how the money ultimately got spent and the impact. But I think for me, one of the main things that I have concerns about going forward is really just I think the capabilities and the loss of that experience. The US government cannot mobilize something like the Ebola response that we put together for West Africa at this moment in time. There are people who are trying to rebuild some of those capabilities within the State Department, but these are things that took generations to do. These are things that are no longer there on what seems like a whim. But I also think about the role that we played beyond, more that, heavy operational element. In my experience, we've often punched above our weight, although sometimes below, to be clear. And that's been a blend of bringing the money, the political influence,
Yeah.
and the expertise together around a problem set. Right now, I think our plan seems to be mostly the influence and maybe some cash. I think it's a risky strategy, but I think above all else, it's the loss for the warts and all of our history of aid, not just out of state USAID, but other elements in terms of what kind of a country we are and the principles, the values that underpin that. And I think we can see what the long-term consequences of that are. And, I think it's deeply regrettable. And I hope sooner rather than later, leadership will, reach that conclusion. But the damage is, I think, already quite done.
And Courtney, what do you see from here? Like at a personal level, I assume you must have learned so much from the challenge of the roles that you've had over the last. What's next for you personally?
So, great question. I think, if there are ways that I could stay involved in this space personally or professionally, I plan to do that. But with the impacts on the sector being what they are,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that isn't the case. But seeking, opportunities where, the ability, the experience, truly crisis tested, navigating at both an operational level and a policy level, quite a lot of complex issues, can be of value, in this private sector, for example.
Yeah. And I touched on this podcast, right? I think your experiences are hugely relevant, right? It just the issues are strangely common, right? But your experience is hugely relevant. Courtney, we should probably draw a conclusion now. I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me on the podcast, and probably more importantly, thank you so much for the things that you've done in your career to this point, right? It seems like it's always a privilege to speak to people that have done genuinely such important work. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me about it. It's really appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.